All right, guys. So today I want to go over kind of the development documentation, especially within ServiceNow, and how we can structure our documentation process so it's scalable and provides as much insight as possible for some of the script includes, business rules, basically anything that you create in ServiceNow. So, I mean, the first question, pretty obvious, but it's why even document? When you have clear documentation, it really helps with onboarding new developers. So getting a clear overview of your environment and everything you've created within the documentation will really help new developers when they come into your environment. The next big thing is it's drastically going to simplify your release notes. So whenever you have to provide release notes, whether it's to customers or if you're trying to push something to the App Store, you can automate most of your release note documentation if you have a good structure and if you've documented over time. You can easily transition your solutions to the customers. So every time we have something that we built that's custom for a customer, the documentation for it's going to be crucial for them to understand not only how you built it, but how they can use it and build on top of it and expand on it. And then the biggest one that I'm a proponent of, it's going to reduce your impact on code changes. So for example, if you have a script include that you made, and then a couple of different components such as business rules, client scripts, anything that call that script include, if you change the structure or the return object of that script include, you have a very high probability of breaking any other pieces of code that touch it. So we're going to talk about how we can reduce that through our documentation. And then some other small ones is it's going to build a backlog of items when you upgrade. So typically script includes are anything that's custom scripted or custom made is going to be an item that you really need to check when you go through an upgrade process. And if you've already built out all of your custom components in documentation, you already know every single item that you need to check and how it should behave. And then another piece is just sharing information with other dev teams. So this is more of an internal to internal. So for example, if you built out a custom widget or any custom code, you can cross-pollinate those ideas with other sections in the company. So for example, if you built something out for the IT operations side of the house, but you believe that the HR side of the house can really benefit from it, it's really easy to give them access to the documentation instead of giving them access to the full code first, so they don't mess anything up. So going right into it, when you're on a project, you obviously don't have time to document everything. Unfortunately, most people kind of grossly underestimate how much time is really necessary to fully document out pieces for the customer, or even for customers internally, that they don't really understand that documentation can pretty much be a full-time thing. But it's also, you have to understand what are your cost benefits to how much time you want to spend on it. So do you really want to document like forms and list views? No, not really, because the benefit that they're going to give you is very minimal to the amount of time that it's going to spend for you to actually write up documentation onto it. So you really want to target those high impact records. Typically script includes business rules, client scripts, etc. And then after this slide, I'm going to go into an environment that I've set up for this, but you want to create a scalable structure. So you don't want to create a structure that seems pretty random and kind of hard to navigate through. And you want that structure to be repeatable throughout all of your scopes. So whenever a new employee or whenever a customer or anyone goes through your documentation, they are kind of presented the same layout. So it's a clear and concise layout. And then you also want to understand your audience. Not everyone is a developer. So if you're creating documentation for like end users, you don't want to get too technical into it, and you want to create something more along the lines of like a guided setup and not really describing what every single function and parameter does. So I'm gonna get out of this real quick, and I want to show you guys kind of what I'm talking about so you can get a live understanding. So for example, I have made actually a script include that generates the structure for you for your documentation. And the way that I recommend, and I've just, based on some research that I've done, is you typically want to break out your documentation knowledge bases within the application scopes. And the reason I say this is because typically in application scopes, you're pretty much locked down to that scope, and you only have access to the scripts within that scope unless you're implicitly specifying that all scopes can access that piece of code. But more than likely, it's going to be that scope in particular. So what my script does, and let me open it up for you here real quick. Includes. It's very simple. It actually mimics what you see in Studio. So when you call it, you're going to call the documentation knowledge script include, and then you call one function at the very bottom that's called build KB. And what this is going to do, it's going to go and it's going to build a knowledge base with the title that you provide it, and then in the short description, it's going to provide the acronym for it, and then it's going to build up all the categories and so the parent categories and the children categories to mimic one-for-one what you see on the left-hand side on the Application Explorer within ServiceNow Studio. And the reason I chose this was because most people that are developing within ServiceNow are already extremely familiar with Studio and kind of how Studio lays out all of the components. So we want to stick with something that's very familiar to the developers and that's very familiar to users within the ServiceNow environment. Now, what does that look like? So when I ran this, what it does is it creates a knowledge base, and I gave it the name DevTools because this is the actual application scope that this script is within. And I also have some other scripts in there. And then it's going to leave the owner blank, so you can set that afterwards. But then it creates the categories. And as you can see in the categories, they are mimicking the Application Explorer layout one-for-one. So if we go into Service Portal right here, if I open it up, within Service Portal, we have the widgets, the themes, the JS includes, widget dependencies, etc. So when we want to add a knowledge article for it, we actually would go, we would click New, and then we would select basically what category. So for that script include that I had made, it would be within the DT because that's the acronym, right? DevTool acronym that we provided it. And then script includes, which is within server development / script includes. So again, if we were to go server development and then script includes, these are where all of our script includes could be housed in. So the reason we want to follow this structure is because it's extremely scalable and it's applicable no matter what scope you're in. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, we do this, but what about the content, the article body? So instead of making up your own or making your own kind of view to it, what I highly recommend, and I have this listed out in the PowerPoint on the last slide, so these will be hyperlinked for you guys, but there's already industry standards set out for JavaScript documentation that we should really leverage because we can automate a lot of our documentation as long as we take the time to do the inline code commenting. So if we look at the first one that I mentioned in it, it's actually called JSDocs. And this tool, I'm going to look at the cheat sheet for you guys real quick. This is basically, it gives you some commenting structure that you can add within your code. And then when you run it against JSDocs, it'll actually create an HTML template for you to automatically document your code. However, right now at this stage, that this is outside of ServiceNow. So the ideal long-term goal for my documentation script include is I want to basically import the functionality of JSDoc within ServiceNow to support the creation of these knowledge articles in ServiceNow. But for example's sake, so we can see kind of the future we should be pointing to is we want to stick as close to industry best practices and the standards that have already been set by our predecessors within the JavaScript community. So when you Google JSDocs, it basically gives you an example of how you should document your functions, your variables, your classes, any type of prototyping that you perform. And I've taken the overall recommendations for JSDoc and I've brought them into the actual code within the script include. So if we look at the script include here, at the very top, I've given it just kind of the author information. So what is this file? Who am I that made it? And then what version is this on? And then within it, I basically define some of the variables, like what are they? What type are they? So this is a string. These are an array of objects. So we're explicitly defining what some of our variables within the documentation knowledge script include are. And then on top of it, we're also giving a little description of what they are. So it's a human readable explanation essentially for what this variable is and what its purpose is for. And then going down to like functions, for example, in functions, we want to not only say, what does this function do, but what are the parameters and what types of inputs is it expecting? And then what is it returning? So these are some key components to document out because you don't always want to have to read through the function and try to understand what this function is doing. If you can kind of give a Cliff Notes summary of what this function does and how it should be used, this is going to drastically reduce when a new dev comes in and tries to understand the code that you've already built. And again, we're not making up these names like @param and @return and whatnot. These are industry standards that have already been set out for us. So a little bit of studying will help us understand how should we document our code. Now, the reason we want to stick with JSDoc is because JSDoc also has a tool that allows us to kind of automate our documentation. And typically this is in an environment outside of ServiceNow where you actually have access to like the .js file and whatnot, but it's not a far stretch from saying we can take that functionality and actually import it into ServiceNow. So I'm going to show you an example of kind of how I got JSDoc to auto document my script include. Essentially what I did is I took the whole script include with all of my commenting and I took all the contents and then I saved it in this thing, in this JS file, just called it document knowledge.js. So it's a one-for-one copy paste essentially. And then I had to install the package for JSDoc. If you guys are not familiar with package managers in JavaScript, I would highly recommend looking into it and even looking into developing in HTML, JavaScript, just general web development outside of ServiceNow, because it's really going to bring a new perspective onto how you should develop within ServiceNow. So once I have it installed, I can actually go to the location where this document knowledge.js lives, and that's going to be within my desktop. And then I'm going to copy the name, and then I'm just going to call JSDoc once I have it installed, and then the name of the file that I'm trying to auto document. So once you run this, JSDoc actually provides you an output of a whole website on your code, and it automatically creates kind of a documentation structure. And the code looks, I mean, the output looks like this initially. When you have multiple JavaScript files or multiple files in general, your navigation menu on the side will list out all of those namespaces and classes and etc. of what you've documented. So if we click on documentation knowledge, we have a very nice clean layout of methods that we have. So these are all the functions within it: build KB, the inputs that it expects, and then the descriptions that we gave it down here: the title of the knowledge base, the prefix of the knowledge categories, and the short description of the knowledge base. So this is a nice template for us to use to import into the the knowledge article. So what I did was I took this and I opened it in basically an editor, Notepad++, Notepad, whichever is your preferred. And I essentially copied and then pasted into the article. One thing I did change before I pasted it though, is if you look within the documentation, it has a hyperlink that it will provide you. I'm going to show you because I modified this one. So it will give you a hyperlink to basically what it believes to be, excuse me, this is the wrong one. Open in code. There we go. So it'll give you a hyperlink of where it believes to be where it believes the documentation should live in. And I actually modified it right here to point to the script include table and then the sysid of the actual code. So in our ServiceNow, when we look at the article, and let's go to the articles. So if I view this article, and if I click on the actual documentation knowledge.js, it's going to open the actual record for you. So you have a clear reference of what is this KP article actually documenting. Now, one thing that I want to take a step further beyond just the regular JSDoc, and it's a functionality that I want to build into when I import this over, but also one of the steps that we should really perform is when you're documenting any piece of code within ServiceNow or any custom apps, I would highly, highly recommend documenting your dependencies. Now, what do I mean by that? So for example, if you're creating a business rule, and then within that business rule, you're calling a script include to perform some kind of logic or some kind of checks against your inputs and outputs, document that within the business rules knowledge article. So at the bottom, what I would highly recommend is we put a dependencies section. And then within that dependencies, you list out what script includes or any other piece of code that you're calling that needs to be used so that business rule is functional, essentially. And then what that will allow you to do is when you go in and, for example, if that business rule is no longer operating correctly, you know everything that it's dependent on right away. So you can go in and follow the troubleshooting stack and say, okay, I'm going to go check its dependencies to see if the outputs have changed and to see if basically the code and the logic in that dependency has been altered. And you can easily see that by the version control that ServiceNow already does. But it's a really nice tool for us to basically get a high-level vision, sort of like the CMDB BSM view, where you're looking from the top-down CI and you're saying the CI needs So XCI needs YCI to operate appropriately. And that's kind of the view we want to get within our documentation, because that's really going to reduce our technical debt over time, especially when new devs are coming in and modifying someone else's code, and then they're not really understanding the impact that that's going to have. So one other small component that I would highly recommend within ServiceNow is also documenting out and creating a structure for your JSON objects. So about 99% of the time in ServiceNow, portals, widgets, most things actually in ServiceNow are driven by JSON objects and kind of the values that they have within them. So when we work with JSON objects, some tools that we should really leverage and utilize are libraries such as TV4. And let me go into it real quick. So TV4 basically, no, not TV, not this one. I'm just opening it because I've already ported it over into ServiceNow. DevTools, there we go. I'm gonna go straight to the GitHub. So TV4 is a JSON validator, and essentially what you do is with TV4, you create a map of the JSON return. And then what TV4 does is every time the REST endpoint or script include or whatever that provides that JSON object back, it can check against the object and it says, does this does this JSON that has just been recently returned match the map that I have? And if not, it will basically allow you to add some error handling in there and say, okay, so if the response is not as expected, throw X error instead of basically crashing the whole application, or potentially even worse, inserting corrupt or messy data within your database. So we really want to stay away from that, and we really want to make some powerful error handling and edge case exception handling within our code. But those are two key tools that I would highly recommend using. So basically JSDocs as well as TV4. And TV4, I've already ported it over into ServiceNow, and I'm going to work on some more documentation as well as how to use it essentially within ServiceNow. And I would like to basically show that to you guys in another Share the Wealth whenever we get some time. But right now, I think documenting our code and especially showing those dependencies is going to have a really, really good impact on our code, as well as giving us the ability to really bring new developers in and allow them to pick up where we left off a lot easier than us having to sit there and babysit and basically explain everything that we've done in our code to them. So I'm going to be providing at the end of today this script include as well as kind of a how to use it and the knowledge articles for it. And I'm also going to be publishing this on a public GitHub and sharing it on developer.servicenow to see if we can kind of get the community to assist in bringing JSDocs essentially into ServiceNow, bring that to fruition, and maybe get some more ideas from people within the community for features that they would like to see in it. I don't really see this as kind of a marketable app, because most companies will want something that kind of generates revenue for them or has some kind of ROI potential. Even though this does have a really high ROI, most companies don't really spend a lot of money on dev tools. So I really want to make this kind of free for the public and allow the public to help it grow. So if anyone has any questions on why I chose JSDocs or kind of what some of the other industry standards, and again, I've highlighted out a lot of the standards here on slide number 5, and this slide is also going to be available for download on the Google Drive. And I'm also going to publish it on my LinkedIn. But if any of y'all have any questions right now, I can address those. Or if you have any recommendations or changes that I should make, feel free to chime in and we can talk about that.
Yeah, it looked like David Arbor posted a comment to chat. I don't know much about what was just said.
Yeah,
I'm not
no
a developer,
worries.
but about Visual Studio Code. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so Visual Studio Code is basically an IDE, and it's really powerful. So think of it as Notepad on steroids. So it has some really good extensions, and it also does basically highlighting. So it highlights based on whether it detects if it's a HTML or JavaScript. So it'll highlight your lines, and it gives you a really clean coding environment. Some other really powerful components of Visual Studio Code is the ability to install some extensions. And there's actually a really nice extension made for ServiceNow in Visual Studio Code, which is called Snitch. And I use it pretty extensively. So what Snitch does is it essentially integrates your Visual Studio Code to your ServiceNow instance. And for right now, it doesn't support like tables or any of those components, but it does support all of the scripting in ServiceNow. So if I go into, these are my Snitch folders essentially. So if I open all of this in Visual Studio Code real quick. So when I imported with Snitch, when I ran Snitch against my instance, it basically pulled and it organizes them by your scoped application name. So these are my scoped apps. And then if you look within the scoped apps, it pulls the SP widgets, script includes, and these are the sys scripts, which house some like the business rules and whatnot. And you can actually modify, for example, your script include within Visual Studio. And the nice thing with Snitch is it also brings in the same like error checking that ServiceNow has and the same recommendations that ServiceNow has. So for example, if I make a test function here and new glide, as you can see, it gives me the recommendations the same as ServiceNow would be. So it would say, as I'm typing glide, it would say, are you trying to say glide aggregate, glide Ajax, glide record v3. So it has all of those constructors built in, and it recognizes that you are coding specifically for ServiceNow. So it's a really powerful utility. And the nice thing with basically writing your code outside of ServiceNow and having it sync back up is absolute worst case scenario. If you lose something, you always have a local version, as well as you have access to other utilities that you may not have in ServiceNow, such as like your Git repository tools. So you can do diff checks before you even push it up. So Snitch has a built-in diff checker. So when it's uploading, if it detects something different or something has changed since the last time you pulled it down, it'll ask you to merge your code so you don't have any conflicts. So you get a lot of functionality when you actually code outside of ServiceNow and upload to ServiceNow. So I would highly recommend using some sort of external IDE especially VS Code, because it's so powerful and it's free. Essence script. Yeah, I haven't personally used Essence script sync, but if you want to talk about it, David, feel free to take the mic over.
I mean, just really briefly, it's just, it does a lot of the same things that Snitch does that you're showing, but it also has a Chrome app that goes along with it that does some markup in your actual instance on your pages. So for instance, you can turn it on to say you want to see the technical names of all your fields, and it's going to show you the table name of every field right under the label that's native to the application. So that's a really cool one to check out too. That one's got a lot of following on the on VS Code as well. So I just wanted to throw that one out there as an alternative.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds really powerful.
Yeah, it's super cool. This is awesome, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's just little things like this that can really help promote rapid development, right? So when you're in an environment and you're thinking like, oh, I need a utility that performs, XYZ task. Another really good thing to do is when you save it in a knowledge base and through knowledge articles, and if you have the time to go back and kind of add those meta tags to it and properly document out your code, you can add those to basically search queries. So when a developer is going in, he can search for those keywords or search for something similar to the functionality that he or she is trying to make, and we could really reduce basically the amount of duplicate code out there as well. So it's not just a matter of getting a new dev to be comfortable within your environment, but you can also reduce duplicate code as well. And when you enforce kind of like those industry standards, everyone's code kind of starts looking the same. And that's really what you want, because you want it to feel like one person really wrote it, because that consistency makes it so the code is really easily scalable. And there's actually some really nice documentation that ServiceNow themselves has made. Come on. Control click. Sorry, my browser's a little slow today. So ServiceNow actually has some industry standards that they have for script includes, scripted REST APIs, service portal development, scoped application scripting. So they've really went out of their way and thoroughly documented kind of how you should create things and how you should really like name your variables. So it's the little things that people might forget about, but it can really go a long way. Like if you clearly define a variable name and it kind of explains itself, it helps in your documentation as well. So this is a really, really good resource to look at and kind of review whenever you have some free time, or especially if you're a junior dev and you're trying to basically learn how to go to that next level. The biggest thing that can really hinder your growth is learning the wrong methods, right? Because it's really hard to unlearn something. So you might as well learn the industry standards before you just go and willy-nilly YouTube things up and go on Stack Overflow and try to figure things out yourself. And then also for those like really hardcore developers that want to take it next level and follow not just ServiceNow standards, but just overall global standards, Google has also made what's called the JavaScript style guide. So if you're trying to have your code look extremely professional, easy to read, and easy to extend and prototype on, Google has a really, really in-depth guide. It can be a little complicated and technical, so I would not recommend this for like a junior dev or somebody that's fairly new to these industry standards, I would highly recommend the ServiceNow guide first. And then if you're up for the task, really looking at kind of how Google and some of these other super large corporations out there recommend that you write your code. Because I mean, if we look at Google, it's one of the biggest companies in the world. So they're definitely doing something right. So you always want to learn from the best and aspire to be better than them.
Yeah, this is a great resource. I pretty much live by this as well.
Yeah.
Google JavaScript. It's great.
Yeah. So if anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask me now. If you think of a question later on, or if you don't know how you should document a certain piece of your code using the JSDocs documentation standard, again, feel free to reach out to me. Right now, what I'm trying to work on my free time is essentially porting over JSDocs functionality into ServiceNow so it can generate knowledge articles. That is my key #1 priority. And it's basically, if you want to think of it from a high level, it's going to fire on a business rule on insert and update. So essentially, whenever that record is inserted or updated, the knowledge article for that business rule within its scope, within its KB, is going to be activated. So it's going to be similar to JSDoc, but it's going to be automatic, so you don't have to basically reprocess every time. All right, well, that's essentially what I had to show. I really want to go in depth on TV4 on our next round. And again, if you want to do some studying for that before we even get to it for our next Share the Wealth, I recommend looking at its GitHub and just studying about JSON validators and what they are and what they do and kind of their use cases. But JSON validators can literally save your application from crashing because, as you all know, don't typically stay static over long periods of time, especially when you're hitting resources that are fairly new and their REST APIs are changing over time. And whoever made that resource, if they don't practice proper version control on like their REST APIs or their libraries, then you can really get yourself in some hot water where you might be expecting a certain output, but the output doesn't match. And that's really where JSON validators can save your life, because before you even start any of your logic, you can check the whole JSON object all at once without having to individually check every single time you want to call a specific subset of that object. And a good example of that would be, like, for example, if you had an object named person. So let's do this. So if we have an object named person, and we expect person to look kind of like this, where we have a name, and then DOB, so date of birth, and then gender, I guess we'll give it that. So we expect that the person object looks like this. It has a name, a date of birth, and a gender. And then we can say, okay, we don't really care if the gender is actually there. It's an optional field because we're not really performing any extensive logic against it. We're just displaying its value if it's present. Then what you can do when you use a JSON validator, you can actually specify what is required versus what is optional within the JSON objects. And then when you create those JSON maps, and there's tools out there that will automatically map it for you, what it does is when you hit the REST resource or the script include or whatever resource, and you are expecting this output to come back, this object, what the JSON validator does, it says, okay, I know what it's supposed to look like. Now give me what's coming in, and does it have these keys? We don't necessarily care about the values in this case because it's going to be a simple validator. We just want to make sure that at least name and date of birth are present within the object. Now you can even take it next level and you can say name has to be a string and date of birth has to be a JavaScript date object. And you can do that, and then your validator will confirm the types of the returns as well. So it can really reduce the amount of code that you have to write. And the way that I ported TV4 over is it actually uses a table for those maps. So we can actually just save all of our mappings within a table, or you can save them within another script itself. So it's really up to you. But again, TV4 is a huge lifesaver. And the nice thing about TV4 versus all the other highly recommended JSON validators out there is TV4 has a one-to-one porting over into ServiceNow. So I did not have to modify any of the code. That means we know that it's supported and it meets the latest version requirements. It's a strict copy paste. The package is very small compared to all the other validators out there. And the likelihood of it breaking or operating in a bad manner is extremely low because it's a one-for-one copy and nothing had to be modified. So that's the main reason I chose TV4. But you can always go with other validators. They're just a lot harder to port into ServiceNow. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I guess we can wrap this up, Courtney. And then I can provide you with the XML record for the documentation knowledge, as well as my PowerPoint that has some of the external resources on how to document in ServiceNow.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kenny, for presenting. This was really, really well done. We appreciate you taking your time to do it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. All right, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.